The siren turned off, cut through the silence of the night, but inside the squad car, danger simmered in every glance. Rick Sanders drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the dirty streets of the neighborhood. Beside him, Tom Reynolds took a sip of cold coffee and cast a contemptuous look at the dark alleys. Neither of them needed to speak to know what the other was thinking. "Did you see that?" Sanders murmured, leaning slightly forward. Reynolds followed his gaze. A black car, a well-maintained model, was cruising slowly down the pothole-filled street. Inside, a black man drove calmly, eyes fixed on the road. He wasn't from around here, you could tell from a distance. "Time to work," Reynolds said, tossing the styrofoam cup out the open window. "Let's see what we've got here." Sanders gently accelerated, closing in on the suspicious car. The red and blue lights flashed, bathing the rundown buildings with colorful strobe-like lights. The driver followed the rules, pulling over to the shoulder without haste. "Look at that," Sanders said, flashing a crooked smile. "I'll bet $100 this guy's got something dirty in the glove compartment." Reynolds chuckled. "Maybe we won't need to look that far." The two got out of the car, hands relaxed on their weapons. Sanders knocked on the suspect's car roof, making the driver glance at the rearview mirror. Smart eyes. Eyes that didn't show fear. "Burnt taillight, boss," Sanders said, with a falsely friendly tone. "Please step out of the car." The man didn't argue. He got out calmly, hands visible as though he'd done this before. Tall, well-dressed, moving slowly. He didn't belong in this forgotten part of the city. Reynolds pretended to inspect the car, slipping his hand under the seat where he had hidden a small bag of white powder just minutes earlier. With a satisfied smile, he pulled the package out and held it up. "Well, well," he said, feigning surprise. "What do we have here?" The driver, Elijah Carter, raised an eyebrow. His face remained expressionless, as if watching a poorly rehearsed play. Sanders stepped closer, studying his reaction. No surprise, no anger, just a calculating, observant look. "Anything to say, friend?" Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if studying the two cops. Then he smiled, a short, almost imperceptible smile. "Do what you have to do," he replied, his voice calm. Sanders exchanged a glance with Reynolds. This wasn't how things usually went down, but who cared? It was just another case, another suspect off the streets, or at least that's what they thought. The engine of the squad car purred softly as Rick Sanders and Tom Reynolds navigated the dimly lit streets of Chicago, with Elijah Carter handcuffed in the back seat. The silence inside the car was almost suffocating. Reynolds broke the silence with a short laugh. "Man, you're pretty calm for someone who just got caught with drugs in the car. What do you think of that, Sanders?" Sanders glanced in the rearview mirror, studying Elijah's serene expression. "Maybe he knows there's no way out. Probably used to it." Elijah just gave a slight smile. "Or maybe I know you made a big mistake." The cops exchanged looks but didn't respond. The precinct building appeared ahead of them, its cold lights reflecting off the wet asphalt. As they arrived, Sanders opened the back door and pulled Elijah out without ceremony. "Let's go, smart guy." Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was heavy. The sounds of phones ringing, keyboard taps, and tired voices filled the space. Elijah was led to a cold, windowless interrogation room where Sanders and Reynolds made him sit. "Now you're going to tell us where that white powder came from," Reynolds said, crossing his arms. Elijah tilted his head slightly, sizing up the two. "Interesting you're asking that, considering you're the ones who put it there." Sanders laughed, but there was a hint of discomfort in his gaze. "And why the hell would we do that?" Elijah leaned back in the chair. "You know exactly why." The detectives ignored the provocation and kept pressing Elijah. Questions were asked, veiled threats were made, but Elijah remained calm, unshaken. After a long night of fruitless interrogation, Sanders and Reynolds left the room, frustrated. Outside, the prosecutor was already reviewing the case, ready to move forward with the charges. Elijah was left alone in the room, staring at his handcuffed hands on the table. It wasn't time yet. The game was just beginning. The hours dragged on in the cramped cell where Elijah Carter awaited his fate. The smell of mold filled the air, mixing with the sweat and fatigue of the other inmates. The murmur of tired voices and echoing footsteps resonated through the corridors. But he remained silent, observing everything around him. Every movement, every detail. Across town, Rick Sanders and Tom Reynolds relaxed in a bar frequented by cops. The atmosphere was dark, filled with cigarette smoke and loud laughter. They toasted, confident that Elijah would be just another name in a long list of easy convictions. "Man, that was easy," Reynolds said, taking a sip of his beer. "The prosecutor already confirmed he's got everything he needs," Sanders smiled, leaning against the bar. "Another criminal off the streets. No questions, no problems." Reynolds laughed and clinked his glass against Sanders's. "And to think he didn't even react. We planted that little packet and boom. Who's going to doubt two decorated detectives?" Sanders chuckled. "No one. That guy's done. Tomorrow. He'll be in court, and by then, everyone will have already decided he's guilty." What they didn't know was that they were about to face the biggest twist of their careers. At the police station the next morning, Elijah was brought to a small office within the precinct. Sitting across from him at the table, his lawyer, Martin Holloway, calmly adjusted the papers. "They've got a strong case against you, Elijah," Martin said, adjusting his glasses. "The evidence is all stacked up and the prosecutor won't go easy on you." Elijah crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly. "And what's the real situation?" Martin smiled, a sharp gleam in his eyes. "The real situation is I've got some tricks up my sleeve, but we need to play this right." They spent the next hour discussing strategies. Elijah showed no signs of hurry or desperation. He knew this game was one of patience. He understood that the coming days would be crucial. Behind-the-scenes manipulation. While Elijah and his lawyer were formulating their defense, Sanders and Reynolds continued their usual practice of ensuring the case had no flaws. The ambitious prosecutor, Walter Briggs, was already reviewing the files meticulously. "The cops swear they found the drugs in the guy's car," Briggs said, drumming his fingers on the desk. "We've got witnesses and their records. That's enough for a jury to buy it without a second thought." On the other side of the desk, Sanders and Reynolds nodded, satisfied. "No chance he's getting out of this," Reynolds assured. But as they settled into their confidence, Elijah Carter continued to watch, analyze, and wait. The first piece of the chessboard had been moved. The game had only just begun. The morning of the trial dawned cold and cloudy in Chicago. The precinct was bustling, with detectives coming and going, filling out reports and discussing cases as if they were just numbers in an endless pile of work. But for Elijah Carter, this wasn't just another day. It was the day his fate would begin to unfold before the justice system. Rick Sanders and Tom Reynolds arrived early, as confident as ever. They wore their freshly pressed suits and carried folders filled with the falsified case reports. To them, this was just another job well done, a guaranteed conviction. "Today's going to be a walk in the park," Reynolds said, adjusting his tie in the bathroom mirror. "The prosecutor's ready to crush that bastard." Sanders gave a smug smile. "And the best part? There's nothing he can do to get out of this. The jury will walk into the room already thinking he's guilty." As the two prepared, Elijah Carter sat alone in a separate cell, waiting to be escorted to court. He remained seated on the hard wooden bench, his eyes fixed on the wall in front of him, his expression serene. It wasn't the look of a defeated man. It was the look of someone already 2 steps ahead in the game. His lawyer, Martin Holloway, arrived on time. He passed through security and was led to the cell where Elijah was waiting. Upon seeing him, Elijah slowly rose to his feet. "Ready?" Martin asked, opening his briefcase and checking a few notes. Elijah gave a slight smile. "Always." Martin studied his client for a moment. "The cops are confident. The prosecutor is too. But we have the element of surprise on our side. Let's do this right." Elijah nodded. He knew this trial wasn't just about his innocence. It was about exposing the truth, flipping the script on those who thought they were in control. The courtroom. The courtroom was packed, Journalists and reporters whispered among themselves as they organized their notebooks and cameras. In the jury box, ordinary men and women watched the room with neutral expressions, awaiting the start of the trial. The judge entered and everyone stood in respect. Walter Briggs, the prosecutor, took the floor. He was an imposing man with a confident, assured tone. He presented the case as a simple crime. A man caught with drugs in his vehicle. Nothing special, nothing complex. Just another case where the police were doing their duty. Ladies and gentlemen, of the jury, this is a straightforward case. The police found concrete evidence, and the detectives testifying today are respected officers with years of exemplary service. The defendant was caught red-handed. There's no doubt about his guilt. In the defense seat, Elijah remained impassive. His gaze met Sanders and Reynolds, who were watching him with discreet smiles, certain of their victory. The judge granted permission for the defense to make its opening statement. Martin Holloway rose, walked calmly to the center of the room, and looked directly at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, things are not always what they seem. Today, you'll hear a story that may seem clear at first, but I assure you by the end of this trial, you'll see that there's more to this case than the prosecution wants you to believe. I ask only that you keep an open mind. There was something in his voice that caused a few jurors to exchange subtle glances. There was an unspoken promise there. Something more was coming. The murmurs in the courtroom quieted as the first officer took the witness stand. Rick Sanders adjusted his tie and cast a confident glance at the jury before answering questions from prosecutor Walter Briggs. Detective Sanders, could you tell us how you found the drugs in the defendant's car? Briggs asked, slowly pacing the room. Sanders cleared his throat and nodded. We received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity in the area. When we stopped Mr. Carter's vehicle, he seemed nervous. We conducted a routine search and found a bag of white substance under the seat. Briggs nodded in satisfaction. Did he show any resistance to the approach? Not physically, but his attitude suggested he knew he was in trouble, Sanders replied with a half-smile. In the defense seat, Elijah remained still, his eyes locked on the detective. He noticed Sanders's rehearsed tone, the calculated way he measured his words to sound convincing. Martin Holloway, his lawyer, made a few notes before rising for cross-examination. Detective Sanders, did you have a warrant to search my client's car? Sanders hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. No, but reasonable suspicion allowed us to act. Holloway gave a slight smile. And that suspicion came from an anonymous tip? Yes. And did that tip include any concrete evidence or just a vague allegation? Sanders swallowed. Just the allegation. Holloway paused dramatically. So, without prior evidence, you decided to conduct a warrantless search, and by coincidence found drugs in my client's car. Briggs stood. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is implying misconduct without evidence. The judge considered for a moment. Sustained. Mr. Holloway, proceed with caution. The lawyer nodded and changed tactics. Detective, you mentioned that Mr. Carter appeared nervous. Don't you think anyone would be apprehensive if approached abruptly by the police at night, with no apparent reason? Sanders crossed his arms. Maybe, but our experience teaches us to recognize the signs. Signs that justify ignoring due process? Holloway quickly retorted. Sanders didn't immediately respond, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the courtroom. The jury began to shift in their seats, paying close attention to the unfolding cross-examination. The first crack in the prosecution's story had been exposed, but there was still more to come. The courtroom was steeped in tense silence, a strange calm hanging over everyone. Judge Charles Whitaker maintained his impassive expression as defense attorney Nathaniel Graves rose to call his next witness. It was a crucial moment, and the atmosphere seemed ready to explode at any second. Elijah, who had remained silent up until now, sitting next to his attorney, felt the pressure mounting. The case was unfolding in a way more difficult than he had anticipated, and the prosecution seemed unbeatable with evidence piling up against him. But there was something he knew that the others didn't. Something he had kept to himself, waiting for the right moment to act. He glanced around, observing the tense faces of the jurors, the rigid posture of the detectives accusing him. Sanders and Reynolds, the two main figures behind the plot that almost destroyed him, sat in the defendant's box, visibly confident of their victory. Yet their smiles began to falter as Elijah felt the tension inside him, that sense that something was about to happen. Nathaniel Graves seemed hesitant, as if he too knew something was about to change. He looked at Elijah, who, with a simple hand gesture, signaled that it was time. The defense attorney nodded, and that's when Elijah did the unthinkable. With a calm and calculated motion, he withdrew his CIA badge from his inner pocket. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. It wasn't an impulsive gesture, but something meticulously planned, a final touch to a strategy he had been crafting since the beginning of the trial. He held it up for a moment, letting all eyes fall on him. The air seemed to freeze for a second, as if time had slowed down. The sight of the badge, so simple yet so powerful, cut through the silence of the room like a sharp blade. The jurors, the attorneys, even the judge seemed paralyzed, absorbing the weight of the revelation. The detectives, who had been so certain of their victory, turned pale immediately. Sanders, the more arrogant of the two, was the first to react, but the response was visceral. He swallowed hard, his expression twisting into one of disbelief. Elijah then slowly stood up, his silent presence filling the courtroom. He knew this would be the final piece of the puzzle. With a firm and calm voice he spoke, his words echoing off the cold walls of the courtroom. "I am Elijah Carter, CIA agent. From the beginning I knew something was wrong here, not just with the charges against me, but with the entire operation, from the moment I was accused. With this badge, I have the authority to prove that everything that has happened was a setup, a trap, orchestrated by you." The room was now completely still. Everyone, even the jurors, was trying to process what they had just heard. The prosecutor, who had previously been relentless and confident, seemed to have lost control of his own expression. He swallowed hard and, unsure of how to react, requested a recess, trying to reorganize his thoughts. But the damage was already done. The introduction of the badge not only dismantled the prosecution's case, but also shattered the confidence Sanders and Reynolds had in their position of power. What had seemed like a simple drug trafficking charge suddenly transformed into a case of deep corruption within the police force itself. Defense attorney Nathaniel couldn't hide a victorious smile. He knew this revelation would change everything. With Elijah at the center of it all, the weight of the truth began to fall on the shoulders of the corrupt detectives. What followed was a moment of pure chaos. The detectives exchanged nervous glances while the prosecutor, still trying to react, asked for more time, more space to investigate the revelation. But Elijah had already said enough. He knew the court now had all the pieces needed to see the truth. "That's my word, but I have the proof," Elijah concluded, looking directly at the jurors. He wasn't just defending his innocence anymore. With the badge in his hands, he was now directly accusing the real culprits. The courtroom was in a controlled frenzy, the murmur of discussions between the attorneys and jurors blending with the muffled sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. Elijah's revelation, now known by all, still hung in the air like an inevitable shadow. He remained standing, calm while the murmurs grew louder. But he knew this wouldn't be the only game-changing moment. The bigger part of the battle was yet to come. The room was tense. Judge Whitaker, still recovering from the shock of Elijah's CIA badge revelation, looked at the prosecutor, who seemed suddenly stripped of his unshakable confidence. Prosecutor Jeremy Ford tried to regain control, but his face was pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He didn't know how to react to the new twist. Meanwhile, Elijah's defense attorney, Nathaniel Graves, remained calm, unhurried. He wasn't concerned about the chaos around him. To him, time was on his side. Elijah's case, with the evidence of police corruption, was in a strong position. But he needed to ensure the jury wasn't just convinced by the badge revelation. He needed something more. With a calm gesture, Nathaniel requested the floor. The judge waved his hand, allowing him to proceed. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what Mr. Carter just revealed is not just a confession of his innocence. This is not a simple defense. He has brought to light a scheme, a gross manipulation that didn't start yesterday, but has been dragging on for months, if not years. And we have here the irrefutable proof of who is really behind it all. With a decisive motion, Nathaniel pressed a button on a remote, and the lights in the room went out, plunging everything into momentary darkness before a large screen illuminated the back wall. The jury, the attorneys, everyone's eyes were fixed on the screen, which began to show a high-definition video. The video was short but incredibly direct. The first image was of a deserted street, the sound of a camera adjusting and the muffled nighttime ambiance. It was clear the footage was being filmed from a parked car. Then, the camera moved to show what seemed to be a vehicle exchange, but the details were clear enough for anyone to understand. At the center of the scene were the two accused detectives, Sanders and Reynolds. They were in the middle of the footage, acting in perfect coordination. As if trained for this, they opened Elijah's car door, removed suspicious packages, and carefully placed them in the vehicle, staging the scene as though it were just another operation. The hidden camera, positioned at a strategic point, captured every detail. The furtive glance between them, the way the drug packages were placed, as if they were part of a fabricated scenario. The footage was clear. There was no doubt about what was happening. Sanders and Reynolds were planting drugs in Elijah's car. The courtroom was in complete silence. The jurors, who until that point had been torn between the evidence and suspicion of manipulation, now looked at the screen with expressions of disbelief. The detectives, once confident, now seemed small and vulnerable. Sanders, who had spent the entire trial with a superior look, had sweaty palms and a look of panic that spread rapidly across his face. Elijah, watching it all with a fixed gaze, showed no emotion. He knew this moment was more than a turning point. In the courtroom, it was a public humiliation for the accusers, irrefutable proof that corruption within the police department had manipulated everything. He knew the war wasn't won yet, but that video had the power to tear apart the web of lies surrounding them. Nathaniel, unhurried, let the silence spread through the room, allowing everyone to process what they had just witnessed. He turned to the jurors, his tone serious but respectful. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just seen is not a fantasy. It's not an empty allegation. This footage is the only truth that matters here. Detectives Sanders and Reynolds not only lied, but they committed grave crimes, manipulating evidence to incriminate an innocent man. This is not about defending Elijah Carter. This is about justice, about holding accountable those who use the authority given to them to corrupt and destroy lives. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Prosecutor Ford, finally losing control, stood up, trying to counter, but his words came out disconnected, lacking strength. Judge Whitaker, who had remained distant until then, now looked directly at the defendants. He knew the weight of the evidence was clear. The prosecutor tried to argue that the footage could have been manipulated, but the jurors were already beginning to make their own judgments. Meanwhile, the detectives, now with slumped shoulders, could no longer deny what was before them. They were cornered, and the whole room knew it. The truth had finally stepped out of the shadows. The courtroom was in a state of absolute frenzy. Prosecutor Ford desperately tried to reverse the situation, his words wavering and lacking the confidence he once had. The jury, however, was no longer listening to his empty claims. The weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. Detectives Sanders and Reynolds were visibly shaken, speechless, as the video continued to echo in their minds. They could no longer hide behind their lies. The truth was out, and the court knew it. Judge Charles Whitaker observed the scene with the same rigid composure he always maintained. He had witnessed many complicated cases, but this one felt personal. The corruption the detectives represented was not just a mistake in judgment. It was an affront to justice, something that shattered the trust everyone had in the law. He knew his decision had to be not only firm, but historic. The weight of his responsibility felt heavier than ever. After the break, where the attorneys tried to regroup, the room returned to an absolute silence when the judge returned to the bench. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the accused, the two men who had become symbols of a broken system. Sanders was pale, his hands trembling, while Reynolds looked around, as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge began, his voice firm. "You have seen the evidence. The video exposed the truth clearly and without ambiguity. The actions of Sanders and Reynolds are a direct assault on the integrity of this court and the trust the public has in justice." The jurors were attentive, their expressions grave and serious. The moment everyone feared, the moment of the verdict, was about to arrive. "I, Charles Whitaker, in the name of justice, order the immediate arrest of the defendants, Detectives Robert Sanders and Michael Reynolds. You will be taken into custody now, and the charges against you will reflect the severity of your crimes. Charges of corruption, evidence planting, and abuse of power are just a few of the charges you will face." The courtroom filled with the sound of handcuffs, a sound that felt more like a victory than a defeat. Sanders tried to rise, his posture still arrogant, but the bailiffs were quick, restraining his hands behind his back. He glared at Elijah, as if trying for a moment to deny reality. "It's impossible," he muttered. "I can't. This can't be." Reynolds was silent, but his eyes showed the growing fear. He looked at the jurors, their faces expressionless, and felt the weight of the conviction on his shoulders. He knew his life would never be the same. The system he had helped corrupt was now consuming him. As the detectives were escorted out of the courtroom, Elijah remained still. He watched them with a calmness that even surprised his own attorney. There was a serene satisfaction in his expression. He wasn't celebrating the arrest of Sanders and Reynolds. He knew that, although justice had finally been served, it couldn't erase the suffering he had endured. But it was a start. It was a step toward healing. "Revenge is not what I seek, only justice," Elijah murmured softly, as if speaking to himself. Nathaniel, the attorney, looked at him with understanding. He knew the man beside him wasn't driven by anger, but by something deeper, a relentless pursuit of truth, a desire to fix what was broken in the system. As journalists, already positioned, in the hallways flooded the room, photographing and recording every move, Elijah walked out calmly, indifferent to the attention. The victory was his, but he knew that didn't mean the end. He still had many battles ahead, and the fight for justice was ongoing. When he crossed the courthouse doors and stepped outside, the sun was setting on the horizon. It was a perfect symbol. The darkness of everything he had faced was beginning to dissipate, but the journey wasn't complete. He still needed to fight for his true freedom, for a future where injustice was nothing more than a distant shadow. Elijah looked at the sky and took a deep breath. The mission was not over yet, but today, at least, he knew he had taken the first step toward changing everything.